Hello there. Here we are. It's the end of the term. How much fun we've been having. And now we find ourselves at the very end, time for the big final exam. And it's beautiful weather outside, and I know you're just sitting there waiting to hear everything live on TV, or more likely on the internet beginning tomorrow, because I'm here all alone tonight. There's not a single person here. But that's okay, because if you're happy, I'm happy, and it's time for us to find out what's going to be on that final exam. So let's go ahead and take a look. Okay. First thing, of course, is when is it? Well, it begins this week. It begins D-Day, the 6th of June. That's this Thursday. And just as we did with the midterm, it will run for 1 week. But I want to emphasize that it will end on June 13th, and it ends early. It ends at 5 o'clock. That's not when you can get in. That's when the doors are locked. So I urge you to check the schedule very carefully of the Social Science Testing Lab. That's over in Center 456, the same place that you went to for the midterm. Check that schedule and get in as soon as possible, because there will be 50 billion people trying to get in for this, the final exam during spring term, when everybody wants to go home. So do check that schedule. And let me just emphasize, it's 5 o'clock. It closes early on Thursday. So if you're waiting till the last minute, you pretty much have put a noose around your neck, because they will not accommodate you. It's that simple. So you get in early. There will be no makeup exams, because it is the end of the term and it is the end of the school year. And people are getting out of town in a hurry. So just don't even ask about a makeup exam. It's not going to happen. There's just not enough time. And check those Saturday hours. They are open on Saturday. So check that calendar, check the schedule, and get in there Saturday if you can, and take the exam. Okay, what is the exam? It's just as we did before. There will be 50 questions. It's an objective exam. It is very similar to what you took during the midterm. So just be prepared for 50 questions. The study guide is now available on Moodle. And this study guide I think you will like, because it is very specific to what you need to know on this exam. Much more specific than it was during the midterm. So go ahead and download that study guide that's on Moodle right now. Check it out. And if you know what's on that study guide, you're going to have a good time with the exam. All right, we move on. A couple of reminders. Remember that you do need photo ID to get in there to take the test. It's just like you did during the midterm. And again, you are allowed one 3x5 note card. So again, the advice that I give you is, if you forget about the stuff that you already know, if you know that information, if you take the study guide, you look at the study guide, and you go, hey, I know all of that stuff except aspect ratio. I'll never get that right. Put aspect ratio, the information about aspect ratio, on your note card. And be sure to check and verify the hours of the testing lab. That is so crucial. It's only to a very reasonable and sensible person would check that, because it is going to be crowded. It is going to be crowded. All right, we move on. Remember, if you are doing extra credit, it is due June 11th. That's a week from tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. That's the end of my office hours next week. And I think the best way to get it to me is email submissions. The deadline is June 11th, though. don't send me the email the following day. But do get it in June 11th. I'm finally in the extra credit mode, and I will begin looking at extra credit right now, reading your papers or looking at your videos. So if you have submitted, and I know only one person who submitted something there, I have to organize myself as well, and so now I'm in the extra credit mode. So I will be getting back to you on that. If you're mailing me a paper or mailing me a video, it must be postmarked no later than June 7th, which is Friday. Okay, moving on. What is going to be on the exam? So let's take a look at it, see what we have discussed and examined since the midterm. And it starts with the combat film. Excuse me there, a little dead air while I take a drink. Through the Edge of Hollywood. So let's take a look at the combat war film. Okay, the features of the genre: laws and morality are suspended. There is a switch from the individual to the group, that is, to the troops, and women as emotional element that brings out male vulnerability. Those essentially are the primary ingredients that you find in the combat and war film. It makes reasonable sense there that the laws of morality are suspended in order to win against an invading enemy. The important thing here is that it switches from the individual to the group. This is just the opposite of the Western, because the Western, the emphasis is always on the individual. Here it switches to the group. It's the group that is important. And essentially it is the camaraderie that is experienced and lived with the troop groups, the groups that you find in a war film. And the third point there is that women are emotional in the sense that they bring out that element and brings us to male vulnerability. All right, we move on. Also, be aware of the anti-war sentiments and post-war films. It is pretty much common knowledge in the history of movies that in World War II, during World War II, the films were very much pro-war in the sense of pro-victory, essentially. What they really were about was success, defeating the enemy, and pretty much ignoring all of the horrible things that go on in war, other than making a kind of romanticized version of that in the sense of sacrifice, death. Like John Wayne in most of his war films, he dies, and he dies. And his death leads to the salvation of others. Okay, so but after the war, and the troops come home, and they face reality. They face PTSD, or what they used to call shell-shocked. The films began to discuss that kind of stuff. So that's what you'll find in post-war films. It's not just simply films that come much later, but the films that, 1946 through the 50s, you'll find a lot of films that deal with the circumstances of what it's like to be in war. And also war films, be aware of what war films do in their portrayal of the racial integration of armed forces, which was discussed in the series. Moving on, the combat war film. What we have here is the fundamental American philosophy or ideology that is embedded in those films, and essentially what our video presentation says, they summarize it this way: we may not always win physically, but we are always right ideologically. So it may not be that we win every war, every battle in a physical sense, but our ideology, our reason for existence. All of that kind of stuff is always right. It will be right. Okay, also be aware of the Office of War Information. This was the role of the United States government in Hollywood film production. It was nothing more than propaganda, and everybody makes propaganda. And its purpose was to shape public opinion. And when I was mentioning the post-war films, which the post-war films began to take realistic look at what happens in war, that was pretty much censored during the war. There was no need to make films dealing with PTSD, dealing with all of the horrors of absolute war when it was going on. There was no use to depress the public as such. And so during the war, it was very much, the films were romanticized and very much giving the impression of, yes, war is hell, but at the same time, it can be won, and our boys are doing their best. Secondly it's the Sergeant York formula, which depicts the conversion of an objector to a supporter. Now, that is the Sergeant York of World War I. And during the war, they turned that movie, or that story of the real Sergeant York, into a film made during the Second World War to give that, essentially, that notion that even a conscientious objector can become a supporter when it's right, when your life is your way of life is threatened, and our ideology is threatened, and so forth, and you can make that conversion and fight for the right. Okay, John Wayne did that very formula in Vietnam, 1968, when he made the Green Berets. Previous to that film were some films that were pretty much anti-war. Also, the culture itself, the American culture, was turning anti-war by 1968. And so John Wayne produced it himself, made a film of using that Sergeant York formula with regard to the war in Vietnam. It was semi-successful. That is, the ordinary man on the street, as it were, went to see the film, enjoyed the film. The critics hated it. But it was a propaganda piece trying to bring some respect to the soldiers who were fighting in Vietnam. Okay, we also then move on to everybody's favorite genre, film noir. The question that is raised in the video series is a simple one. Is it a true genre? The argument still exists today. Is it really a genre, or is it a style? Much of the way that film noir is defined is by its style. And I brought this up during our initial meeting during the orientation session, that is Citizen Kane film noir? Because Citizen Kane very much has the film noir style to it. But few people would ever say, well, it's film noir. What is it? It's a French word that means black film, and the reason that it gets that description is because two reasons. One, the film is very dark and black in the sense that it takes place at night, usually in the middle of town, in the middle of the city, with lots of chiaroscuro effect lighting and wet streets. We'll talk about that in a minute. And also because the subject matter itself is very dark. It's very existential, and we'll get to that. It is film noir, essentially started as adaptations of American pulp fiction and the hard-boiled novels, hard-boiled detective novels. Film noir as a genre, as such, was discovered and debuted in post-war France. That is, in the sense of debut, it means that the French critics saw something in these kinds of films and began to write about it. And thus, we end up with what we call film noir. So specifically, let's take a look at it. What we find in a film noir movie is this kind of a setting. It is always urban. It is usually kind of a Skid Row section of town. It is usually, if not always, rain slick. That is, it may not be raining at the time, but it has been raining. Create some very nice images, especially in black and white photography. That's one of the issues I always had with Chinatown, that famous movie with Nicholson made by Polanski, is that it's in color. And it just, I don't know, it's just my bias there. But it's usually, these filmmakers went really into what you can do with black and white film. And also, I mentioned this, it's the sleazy side of city life. What you have there, it's usually in Skid Row, or it's in really a bad section of town, and the characters you're dealing with are not your good people. Even the detective in these films, or at least the primary figure, who may or may not be a detective, but he's on a search, a quest of some kind, is the good guy in the movie only because he's not as bad as everybody else. The themes, alienation, that's a given. Almost every character is alienated from something. Most of them are alienated from life. Most of them find themselves isolated and alone, hence the existentialism. And they have no way of escape, none whatsoever. They seem to be trapped in the city. And they're trapped in the city in everything that the city means. Not just being literally trapped in the middle of the city, but what the city means, which in many cases, what the city is that it's an enemy itself. It works against you. It hates you. And even some films of film noir give you the city in the title and give it human characteristics, like When the City Sleeps. Those titles like that. So you're trapped in the city, and you're alienated from everything that makes the city. The character types are often amnesiacs. People can't remember why they're there, how they got there. The primary one, which includes the private detective, is that they are antisocial loners. The detective very much has these Bogart and those detectives like that, Sam Spade type characters. They have no friends. They exist only to do their jobs. And at times they don't even like doing their jobs, but it's a job. And the only reason they do it is because they have nothing else. There's nothing else to inspire hope or anything. And again, the part here about private detectives is that's crucial, because this deals not with police officials. This is totally private. This is away from any kind of social order that the police department would bring. So private detectives do get away with more than the police officials, but they still have pretty much a high, or at least a better sense of morality than all the other characters around them. The film style, what gives us this wonderful name of film noir, is the low-key lighting. Lots and lots and lots of shadowy elements. Characters in shadow, characters walking in and out of shadows, silhouettes. In Robert Siodmak's wonderful movie, The Killers, based on the Hemingway story, we see the killers as silhouettes first in beautiful, beautiful image. We just see their figures, their forms. In that regard, they represent menace. There are strange highlights. Think of Citizen Kane in this too, where at times all you see is the person's mouth. Everything else is in shadow. There are extreme camera angles, what they call the Dutch angles. They're tilted, they're high, they're low. They've distorted images. Often they'll even involve, at the what they had at the time, special effects photography to distort, to disorient us. So it's a very strange world. The production code in film noir. This is also something that you should be familiar with, because the film noir often alluded to prohibited subjects without directly violating the code. The production code was still there. It was still saying you can't do certain things, but film noir got away with it. The very creative people that worked in film noir made a lot of naughty movies without being naughty. And if you were an adult and could think about it, and you would hear dialogue, see images, immediately you'd begin thinking of things that you probably shouldn't be thinking of. But they got away with it because they were very creative in that time. Gender issues in film noir, and the primary one there is women as femme fatales. Women are the primary motivators in film noir. They're very much, the men come off as rather weak compared to the women. It's the first film which feminists, when they started feminist film criticism, the feminists went directly to film noir as an example of a feminist type of cinema, because the women usually took command. See a very B movie, low budget of all low budgets, made by Producers Releasing Corporation in 1945, called Detour. And if you want to see the relationship between a dominant female and a very submissive male, you'll see it in that film. It is played out perfectly. It is a perfect film noir. All right, moving on. In summary, we can say that film noir is a social commentary on post-war reality, essentially talking about modern mass American culture, consumerism, and disillusionment with Paradise Lost. Now, the irony of all of this is that it comes at the end of the success with the war. It would take a lot more time than we have tonight to talk about it. But when you think about it, coming at the end of World War II, we are victorious. We have just stopped the world domination. We have stopped the march of the Japanese Empire. We have stopped the German effort to conquer the world, dispatched Hitler, and we're out on top, and our ideology is on top. And yet, as it begins to take its course, we have films then start dealing with the disillusionment with Paradise Lost, with our disillusionment with our own culture. But it takes longer than that. Read. Check out the tons of books on film noir, and you'll get what I'm talking about there. Okay, we move on. And we move on to the post-war decline in attendance. This is film in the television age, the threat of television. But remember that television is not the only culprit. During this time, there is more leisure time. There is more money, and there is interest in other activities, and there is a migration to the suburbs. So it's not just TV that is changing the way the movie industry operates. The agreements between motion picture industry and TV, essentially what happens is that TV becomes a subsidiary market for motion pictures. And what TV does best, it advertises everything. That's all TV is one big giant commercial. And the Hollywood movie industry saw that and began to use television to promote its own movies. The movie industry's response to competition from television, and certainly its decline in attendance, technical innovations. The screen went from flat or square to wide. We saw the big wide screen in Cinerama. You can see things peripherally. 3D comes at us, in which we start throwing things at the audience. Then it settles in on CinemaScope, which is widescreen, is essentially what that is. And it gets replaced by a finer visual effect, which is known as Panavision. That's the aspect ratio, the width to height of projected image. So keep that in mind, and also the technical modifications for widescreen to TV, and you get panning and scanning or letterboxing, recognize safe action area, and so forth. Also at this time, there are creative innovations by independent producers. The American International Pictures begins in the 50s when most of the studios, most companies are dying off, and here comes a new one, but it becomes a success because it taps in to the primary force sitting in theaters, teenagers. Also, monsters. Monsters are everywhere during the 1950s, along with low-budget exploitation pictures, the rise of the independent producers who make films for the major studios, which is essentially what we have today. And the whole idea of leading into that is the box office boffo, that you just don't make a film and be happy with what it makes, but instead you must make a film that brings in $1 bazillion. Okay, the film school generation, the 1960s, the great transition in Hollywood and in films. The older generation, this is best seen in the older generation, the sex comedy with Rock Hudson, Doris Day, called Lover Come Back, versus the younger generation at the end of the 1960s with The Graduate. Okay, I'm not going to go through a lot of this here, but recognize that during this time that we have the 1960s counterculture movements that's going on. We have the ideological war and the generational war. It's baby boomers versus their elders. We have a socio-political climate of madness. We have the assassination of our president in modern times, JFK. We have LBJ and his Great Society. We have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. And then we get Nixon and Watergate. We have university protests, all of this sort of stuff going on. And then we also get women's lib and the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution was a business revolution. The sexual revolution opened the gates for a sex industry. We have images of women during this time. They're either virgins or whores. We have images of youth or college kids with half-baked ideas, images of race, the exploitation films that show up that are dealing primarily with sex, drugs, and violence and ghastly horror, repulsion. We have blaxploitation, a short-lived cycle of black action movies that were interesting films. And then the rating systems disappears. Or, well, actually, the rating system is transformed into an actual rating system. And, okay, I'm not going to go through all of that. Be familiar with modern filmmakers, and I'm going to go through all that, and the new media that's going on. But essentially, just remember your photo ID, 3x5 card. The exam closes early. And I think that's it. And if you got any questions, send an email. If you are stop by tomorrow during office hours, other than that, thanks for understanding movies, and we'll see you again. Bye.